There is a moment most women never forget. Not the moment he walked away, not the moment she realized what she'd been doing to herself for months, sometimes years, inside a relationship that asked everything of her and returned so little. The moment most women never forget is quieter than any of those. It is the moment she stopped. Not dramatically, not with a speech or an ultimatum or a tearful confrontation in the kitchen at midnight. She simply stopped. She stopped mid-sentence, mid-explanation, mid-apology for something she had not even done. And something inside her, something she had not heard from in a very long time, said, "No more." This video is about what happens next. Not to her, to him. Because what happens inside a man's mind when he encounters a woman who has returned to herself, when he realizes that her dignity is no longer negotiable, that she will not bend herself into a smaller shape to keep the peace, that the emotional door he relied on walking through whenever it suited him has not slammed shut, but has simply, quietly, permanently changed its architecture. What happens inside him is one of the least discussed and most psychologically significant events in any relationship. And Carl Jung, who spent his entire life mapping the hidden architecture of the human psyche, gave us the language to understand exactly why. Stay with me, because before this ends, I am going to take you somewhere most relationship content never goes. I am going to take you inside the mind of a man who is watching the woman he thought he understood become someone he can no longer read. And I am going to show you why that shift, that specific, interior, unannounceable shift in her, does something to his psychology that no declaration of love, no ultimatum, no withdrawal strategy, no emotional speech has ever been able to accomplish. And why the women who understand this truth never go back to who they were before they understood it. But first, before we talk about him, we need to talk about her. Because everything that follows, every psychological mechanism that activates in his mind, every internal rearrangement, every silent confrontation with himself that her dignity forces, begins with something she does that has nothing to do with him at all. Jung wrote something that most people read past without understanding. He wrote that individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself, is not a comfortable event. It is, he said, more like a death than a birth, because what has to die is not the worst of you. What has to die is the familiar, the patterns that kept you safe, the adaptations you made in childhood, in early love, in every relationship where you learned, consciously or not, that being fully yourself carried a cost that the other person was not willing to pay. For many women, that cost was paid in silence, in swallowed feelings, in the specific, exhausting labor of monitoring another person's emotional temperature and adjusting yourself accordingly, in the conversations you rewrote in your head before speaking them because you already knew which version of your truth he could tolerate, in the way you learned to need less, want less, ask for less, not because you actually needed or wanted or desired less, but because asking had consequences. Silence was safer. Smallness was easier. And love, or what you were calling love, seemed to require it. This is not weakness. I want you to hear that clearly. This is not weakness, and it is not stupidity, and it is not something to be ashamed of. This is what happens when a nervous system learns, through accumulated experience, that connection requires self-erasure. Jung called this the persona, the mask we construct for the world that allows us to function but gradually disconnects us from the deeper self beneath it. The persona is not deception, it is survival. But survival strategies, carried long enough, become prisons. And the woman who has been surviving inside a relationship that asked her to be small begins to feel the walls of that prison in her body before she feels them in her mind. She feels it as tension, as the specific tightening in her chest when she hears his car in the driveway and is not sure what version of him is walking through the door. She feels it as fatigue, Not the ordinary tiredness of a busy day, but the bone-deep exhaustion of being perpetually on alert, perpetually managing, perpetually holding together a dynamic that should not require this much of her alone. She feels it as the quiet grief of the things she stopped saying because saying them used to matter and then it did not, and eventually she stopped trying to find out which it would be today. And then one day, not because anything particularly dramatic happened, not because she made a decision in the way we usually imagine decisions being made. Something shifts. Something in her stops performing, and that is where everything changes. For her. And then, in ways she may not anticipate, for him. Now let us go inside his mind, because this is where it gets precise. When a man has been in a relationship with a woman who adapts to him, who absorbs his moods, softens her needs, maintains emotional continuity almost entirely on her own, something happens in his psychology that he is usually completely unaware of. He stops seeing her, not in the way we mean when we say someone is being ignored. He stops seeing her in a deeper sense. She becomes, in Jungian terms, an extension of his own psychic landscape, a constant, a given, something his inner world depends on the way the body depends on a heartbeat, completely and without any conscious appreciation, because constants do not require appreciation. They simply are. Jung had a precise term for this. He called it projection. When we project, we place something that belongs to our own interior world onto another person. We stop seeing them as a separate, autonomous being with their own interior life, their own needs, their own growing edges. We see them as a screen onto which our own unconscious material plays. And in relationships built on imbalanced dynamics, where one person consistently gives and the other consistently receives, projection almost always occurs. He projects onto her the image of the woman who is always there, always available, always willing to restructure herself around his comfort. And as long as she performs that role, the projection holds. She confirms it with every adaptation, every swallowed truth, every time she chose the relationship over herself. But here is what Jung understood that changes everything. Projections only survive when reality cooperates with them. The moment the external world stops confirming the internal image, the moment the screen stops playing the expected film, the projection collapses. And when a projection collapses in a man who has never examined it, who has no language for it, who does not even know it exists, the psychological experience is disorienting in ways he cannot name and does not understand. This is the first thing that happens inside him when he realizes her dignity is stronger than her love for him. Not love, grief. Not the grief of losing something he consciously valued. The grief of a structure collapsing. The inner world that was organized around her emotional availability, that drew comfort from knowing she would always reach, always explain, always return, begins to feel unstable. And instability in a man who has been relying on her consistency as a kind of psychic ground beneath his feet produces something that looks, from the outside, like very strange behavior. He becomes watchful. This is the first observable shift, and most women misread it. They think his sudden attentiveness means he is finally seeing them. What is actually happening is something more primitive and more revealing. His nervous system has detected an anomaly. The expected signal did not arrive. She did not reach out after the silence. She did not explain herself after the distance. She did not soften the boundary she drew with the quiet resolution in her eyes. And when an expected signal does not arrive, the brain, his brain, any brain, goes into heightened alertness, scanning, monitoring, trying to gather enough information to re-establish predictability. He watches the way she moves through the room. He notices when she does not look at her phone after sending a message. He registers the quality of her silences, that they are not sad silences, not angry silences, but something he has no word for, settled silences. He starts paying attention to details he never paid attention to before, not because he has become more romantic, but because his internal model of her is no longer accurate, and inaccurate models require updating. He is not admiring her. He is recalibrating. and the fact that he cannot complete the recalibration because she is no longer performing the role that made her predictable, produces in him a specific, quiet, unfamiliar discomfort. This discomfort is important. I want you to understand what it is made of, because women often wait for men to express their internal states clearly, to say in words what they are experiencing emotionally, and in this particular moment, words are almost certainly not coming. What is happening in him is happening in the pre-verbal layers of the psyche. It is happening in the layer that Jung called the unconscious, the vast interior territory that operates beneath language and conscious reasoning, that processes relationship dynamics not in thoughts, but in sensations, impulses, tensions, and unease. The discomfort he is experiencing is the discomfort of encountering a person who can no longer be managed through the old methods. This is not a moral judgment against him. Most people, in most relationships, develop what psychologists call relational strategies, ways of maintaining the connection that feel natural and automatic because they have worked before. His strategy in this relationship involved a reliable sequence. Distance creates anxiety in her. Anxiety produces pursuit. Pursuit produces his re-engagement. Re-engagement resets the dynamic. Repeat. He did not design this strategy consciously. It evolved through repetition, the way all habits evolve, because it produced the outcome his nervous system was seeking. Her continued presence and his continued autonomy within it. When she stops pursuing, not as a tactic, not because she read something online about playing it cool, but because the part of her that used to generate pursuit has gone genuinely quiet, the strategy collapses. There is nothing to respond to. There is no anxiety signal to re-engage with. There is no emotional heat for him to warm himself by and then step away from when it becomes too much. There is just her, moving through her life with a steadiness that his old model has no framework to accommodate. And this is where Jung's concept of the shadow enters the story. Because what happens next inside him is not simply confusion or even loss. What happens is a confrontation he has been, often unconsciously, working very hard to avoid. Jung wrote that the shadow, the collection of traits, fears, and truths about ourselves that we have rejected, suppressed, or simply never examined, does not wait patiently forever. It waits until the external conditions that allowed us to avoid it are removed. And she, without knowing it, without intending it, has removed a very significant set of those conditions. She was, for him, an emotional regulation system. Her availability meant he never had to develop his own capacity for sitting with uncomfortable feelings because she was always there to absorb, process, and smooth them. Her adaptability meant he never had to examine whether his own behavior was producing pain in someone he cared about because she adjusted to the pain rather than naming it as unacceptable. Her love, which was real, which was genuine, which was given from a place of tremendous capacity, functioned, at least in part, as a buffer between him and his own shadow. As long as she was doing the emotional labor, he did not have to look at the parts of himself that required that labor to exist. When she stops doing it, when her dignity reclaims the emotional energy that was flowing outward and redirects it toward her own interior life, the buffer disappears, and he is left standing in a room with himself, with the parts of himself that her love was quietly managing, with the question that her availability was allowing him to never ask. Am I someone worth choosing? Not by someone who needs me, not by someone who has made herself small enough to fit my limitations, but by a woman who is standing fully in herself and seeing me clearly. This question, landing in the pre-verbal layers of his psyche, produces something that most relationship content would describe as him stepping up or him finally chasing. And sometimes that is what it looks like from the outside. He reaches out, he is more present, he pays attention, he says things he has never said. But what is actually happening, and this is the distinction that changes everything for the woman watching this, is not always what it appears to be. Sometimes it is genuine awakening, and sometimes It is his nervous system trying to restore the supply it lost. And the difference between the two matters enormously, because one requires her to witness his growth with an open heart, and the other requires her to hold her ground precisely because his effort feels like love, and she is now learning to distinguish the feeling of love from the presence of love. A man in genuine awakening does something specific. He becomes uncomfortable with himself in a way that produces change, not in a way that produces performance. He does not simply pursue her more intensely. Intensity without direction is not growth. It is urgency. He begins, slowly and imperfectly, and without necessarily being able to articulate it, to look at his own behavior honestly. He takes accountability not because she asked for it, but because the image of who he has been in this relationship, now that her departure from the familiar role has made it visible, is something he cannot make peace with. He begins doing the internal work, not to keep her, but because he has finally encountered himself and found that he does not like everything he sees there. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the tension between the persona and the self. The persona is who we present. The self is who we are. The gap between them is the territory of the shadow. For a long time, he maintained his persona, the man who is emotionally independent, who does not need much, who is not responsible for managing someone else's feelings through her continuous accommodation of it. When she stops accommodating, the persona becomes unsupportable. Reality keeps contradicting it, and in the gap between who he has been performing and who he actually is, growth becomes possible, not guaranteed, possible. Now, I want to talk to you about something that happens to her during all of this. Because his internal transformation, whether it produces genuine growth or simply the performance of growth, is not actually the most important part of this story. The most important part of this story is what happens inside her. Jung wrote that the deepest form of courage is not the courage to confront another person, it is the courage to stop abandoning yourself in order to maintain a dynamic that requires your abandonment to survive. This is what she is doing, perhaps for the first time, when her dignity becomes stronger than her love for him. She is practicing the most fundamental form of psychological courage that exists. She is refusing to keep splitting herself in two, the self who feels and the self who is allowed to act on those feelings, the self who knows and the self who is permitted to speak what she knows, the self who deserves and the self who keeps receiving less. Integration, Jung's term for the process of becoming whole, is not a gentle experience. It is not a warm bath or a meditation or a weekend retreat. It is the specific, often excruciating work of reclaiming the parts of yourself you surrendered to relationships that could not hold them. It is looking at the ways you adapted and understanding not just that you adapted, but why. What early learning made self-erasure feel like love? What wound made smallness feel like safety? What story you absorbed about what women must do to be worth keeping? And then, slowly, refusing to live inside that story any longer. Not because you read about self-worth, because you finally felt in your body what the cost of not living inside your truth has been. This process changes the quality of a woman's presence in a way that cannot be faked, performed, or strategically deployed. This is crucial. Women sometimes hear about the power of dignity in relationships and try to use it as a tool, a way of making him want her more by becoming less available, a technique for inspiring pursuit by withdrawing. And that approach fails, always, because it is not dignity. It is strategy wearing dignity's clothing. And the female psyche, and honestly, the male psyche too, can feel the difference at a level far below conscious reasoning. Real dignity does not feel like distance. Real dignity feels like presence, but a different kind of presence. A presence that is no longer performing, no longer managing, no longer carefully monitoring the emotional temperature of the room and adjusting itself accordingly. A presence that is simply, fully, undefendedly there for herself. And that quality of presence, uncalculated, unhurried, unattached to his reaction to it, is what produces in him the specific experience I described earlier. Not the experience of being rejected, the experience of encountering someone real, someone who can no longer be managed, because managing requires the other person to be operating from a place where your approval matters more to them than their own interior truth. And she has crossed back over that line. And she is not coming back. There is something else that happens inside her during this period that I want to name because it is rarely acknowledged and it is deeply real. It is grief, not the grief of losing him specifically, though that is there too. The grief of losing the version of herself that believed certain things were true. That love required self-sacrifice to be real. That the measure of her worth was how much she could endure without complaining. That if she just understood him well enough, gave enough, adapted enough, he would eventually become the person she saw he could be. The grief of that lost belief is real, and it deserves to be honored, because she was not foolish for believing it. She was working from the only blueprint she had. And something in her finally loved herself enough to recognize that the blueprint was wrong. Jung spoke often about the death that precedes transformation, the part of us that has to be relinquished before the new self can emerge. For her, what dies is not her capacity for love. Her capacity for love is, if anything, becoming more alive, because it is now being sourced from genuine fullness rather than from the fear of what happens if she stops giving. What dies is the belief that her love must be unconditional in order to be worthy.